Did you hear that?
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay,
This
I
is
successfully started a recording. Add that to my resume. Awesome.
okay. I got a few notes. Those who don't know, I'm Tony Millar, president of the Nova Scotia Bird Society, and I'm running on empty tonight. But there we go. Coming up in events coming up, we have our AGM, November the 9th, 1:30 in the afternoon at the Museum of Natural History in Halifax, back to our old home. We'll start off with the official business. Then we're going to have silent auction, some bird-themed items for sale, of course, the NSBS merchandise. And there should also be a reasonable, we'll call it a pile of bird-related books, which will be available for free. Because we do get donated large numbers of those from estates and when people's downsize, shall we say. With posh sandwiches like the Queen used to eat, God bless her, with the crusts cut off. So it's afternoon tea. There'll be a range of teas and coffees and dainties, little cakes, etc., etc. So love to see folks there. Please join us for that. And that's the big upcoming event. And now tonight's main attraction. We have a presentation by Hannah Freeman. Now, Hannah was one of the winners of the Ian McLaren Scholarship for 2023, which was when we established this scholarship. It's in honor of our past president, noted ornithologist and conservationist. It was a true great. I'm honored to have known the guy. Very, very influential in my birding here. Great educator. He's an all-round great bloke, to use an old English phrase. He just was, he could relate to people on any level. He could deal with the best ornithologists in the world and somebody who's got a robin in their yard and wants to talk about it. He was just a phenomenal guy, and we all miss him dearly, are we truthful? We really do. He's just a nice guy. Anyway, Hannah was one of the winners for last year, and tonight we're going to learn about some of the research, and you can read the screen in front of you, determining the effectiveness of forestry beneficial management practices for conserving olive-sided flycatchers. Whew. Over to you, Hannah. Oh, and please, everybody mute.
I mean, unless you want to, pitch in or anything, whatever.
Put
Okay.
some stuff in the chat and you can pick it up and we can take questions at the end.
Okay, I'm
And
not
I'll now
sure
shut up.
I can see the chat while I'm presenting, so I'm doing like a little two-screen thing here, so hopefully this is working out. Okay, all right. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm going to be talking a little bit, like Tony said, about the work I did for my undergraduate honors project. Under the guidance of Dr. Cindy Stasier, my research looked at the effectiveness of forestry beneficial management practices for conserving the olive-sided flycatcher. So before I start talking about the project, I want to quickly introduce myself and talk a little bit about what led me into researching birds for my project. I was born in Edmonton and moved out to Halifax to study environmental science at Dal. I was not very into birds until I went into a course in my second year where I went birding with a friend. I then registered for Dal's ornithology class that's taught by Dr. Sarah Gutowski and had a great time learning, and I completed a project looking at eastern wood pewee vocalizations. That same summer, I had the opportunity to volunteer at a bird banding station in central Alberta for a few weeks and got to see hands-on bird research, literally. So when it came time to look for an honor supervisor, I knew I wanted to do something with birds, so that led me to Dr. Stasier. Now that I finished my honors work back in April, I get my bird fix through my role with the Dalhousie Birding Society and through photographing birds during my own trips. So I just have some pictures here in the bottom left area. You can see my ornithology group. Then the top is me holding a northern water thrush. The middle here is me and Cindy's assistant, Caleb, collecting data for my project. Here's me leading one of the birding trips at the top. We did a presentation at MEC about intro to birding in Halifax with the Dal Birding Society, so I have that there. And then just a really nice yellowthroat picture I got this summer. Okay, all right, now so that you know a little bit about me, I'll get into the project titled Determining the Effectiveness of Forestry Beneficial Management Practices for Conserving Olive-sided Flycatcher. All right, so the olive-sided flycatcher is an aerial insectivore that breeds in forested landscapes across Canada. Unfortunately, it has experienced some population decline, with some data suggesting a 29% decline across North America between 1996 and 2006. In Nova Scotia, the annual decline rate during this period was 2%. The population decline is a result of several factors, but habitat loss in the breeding range and wintering range is a primary one. As a result, the OSFL is currently listed as special concern under Schedule 1 of the Species at Risk Act and as threatened in Nova Scotia. Thankfully, some recent changes in Nova Scotia's approach to forestry might allow for greater preservation of the habitat that this species depends on. So the province has recently shifted to what is called an ecological forestry model following a major review of forestry practices in 2018. In the past, forestry in the province has involved a lot of clear cutting and even aged timber management. Ecological forestry moves away from this mindset and divides the forest on crown land in the province into 3 zones. The first zone is the production forest, which has the primary goal of timber production. The protection forest, also known as the conservation zone, includes national and provincial parks, as well as other protected areas. Obviously, no harvesting is allowed in these spaces. Finally, the ecological matrix is a zone that is meant to balance both biodiversity and ecosystem health with harvesting. One way this is achieved in the province is through partial harvesting completed with consideration to beneficial management practices. Beneficial management practices, or BMPs as they're more often called, are guidelines that aim to reduce the environmental harms associated with the process, such as forestry. These have already previously been created for bird species in the context of harvesting. Recently, species-specific BMPs were created for the OSFL in the context of forestry and were applied in a harvest block in Cape Breton before the spring of 2023. I have the map of the harvest block here. In the figure, the dark green colors represent areas within a 25-meter radius of where the birds were observed during field surveys. The BMP recommendations for this zone included a 100% retention of trees. The lighter green areas represent the space between 25 meters and 100 meters from the bird observations. And in this area, a 30% retention was included in the BMPs. Finally, the darker gray areas representing the rest of the stand are areas where no BMP recommendations were applied and where a general 10% retention was planned. So in addition to the retention guidelines, there were other recommendations in the BMPs relating to the preservation of snags, a limitation on pesticide, herbicide use, and avoiding actions that could potentially impact wetland hydrology. So once these BMPs had been applied in harvesting, we then needed to find out if they were effective, which eventually brings me to my research question of, to what extent do forestry beneficial management practices impact olive-sided flycatcher, a species at risk bird in Nova Scotia? So there were 2 study areas assessed in my project. First was the experimental site on the right here called River Tillard. This is the area that was harvested with the BMP recommendations that I described with the map earlier. We also decided to analyze data from a control site in southwestern Nova Scotia called NHB13. It was partially clear-cut in 2008, but has undergone no management since. These areas were selected due to the presence of OSFL in spring-summer 2022 field surveys, and in the case of River Tillard, the intention to harvest the area and the harvesters being open to using beneficial management practices. In both sites, autonomous recording units, or ARUs, were the primary tool used in data collection. ARUs are small recording devices that are often deployed in remote areas and can be scheduled to record at specific timeframes. For this study, wildlife acoustic song meter minis were the devices used. These units were placed on trees of a suitable diameter that were not blocked by any vegetation and were near locations where OSFL were observed in past field surveys. They were scheduled to record in 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off intervals beginning before sunrise and ending shortly after. The units themselves were collected at the end of the season when all of the olive-sided flycatchers had left for migration. The main reason that ARUs were used in my research was because we were going to be looking at the OSFL vocalizations as a main part of the analysis. So as many of you probably know, the species has two main vocalizations. The song, which is given by males only, is funnily remembered by the mnemonic quick 3 beers. This is primarily used for mate attraction and territory establishment. Their calls, which are often referred to as pips, are produced by both sexes and are used for contact communication between individuals. On the left here, I included some spectrograms of what these vocalizations looks like, as I primarily used sight to identify them in analysis. One characteristic of the OSFL vocalizations that was critical to this project is the observed variation in seasonal song rate and how it aligns with breeding status. So this is similar to past research relating to other species that observes that generally paired males will sing at lower rates as the breeding season progresses, while unpaired males will sing at continuously high rates throughout. A 1997 study done in Alaska by an individual named Wright identified that rate activity would follow 3 distinct patterns if the individual is paired, if the individual has a failed nest, or if the individual does not pair at all. The plot here reflects the song rates observed by Wright for individuals of each breeding status. Here, the area marked as week 1 on the far left represents the suspected arrival of the females. They found that individual males that never paired in the yellow sang at relatively high rates throughout the entire season, whereas the rates from those that paired and nested, as shown in the green, decreased gradually as time went on. For males that experienced nest failure, Wright found that their song rate decreased gradually before increasing again, as shown in the red, likely as a result of reinitiating courtship behavior. While not shown here, it was also observed in that study that paired males that experienced a failed nest would have greater variation in diurnal song rate. So male singing was generally highest early in the morning and declined throughout the day, like with most birds, regardless of whether or not they were paired. However, Wright also noted that for those with failed nests, this pattern was more variable and often included instances of higher singing rates occurring later in the morning. So previous research that explored this relationship outlined by Wright was completed in 2020, so quite recently. One project by Upham Mills et al. Used similar methodologies to Wright and collected song rate data from listening intervals and tied it to behavioral observations of breeding status. So think collecting sticks and bringing food to a nest. They then attempted to differentiate breeding status based on song rate alone using several complex statistical models, eventually finding that all models overpredicted status to an extent. Another project by Brooks looked at total vocalization rates of OSFL in New Brunswick and attempted to differentiate breeding status using a method called change point analysis. However, this study totaled song and pip rates in their analysis as opposed to just looking at song rates as Wright did. Unfortunately, there had been no previous research that tied total vocalization rate to breeding status. Given the shortcomings of the results of both of these projects, I was inspired to assess the vocalizations and breeding success using a more simplistic method. So my methods were broken down into kind of 2 subsections, an acoustic component and a spatial component. The acoustic portion aimed to answer the question, did vocalizations indicate successful pairing and nesting? While the spatial component explored whether harvesting was completed in accordance with the BMP guidelines. So I have a little concise breakdown of my spatial methods here. First, high-resolution imagery of the site pre- and post-harvest was obtained using a drone, and a digital elevation model and digital surface model were generated in a program called Agisot. These steps were completed by Dr. Sacer and her team. From there, a canopy height model was created by subtracting the DEM from the DSM in ArcPro. This layer was then loaded into R, and treetop analysis was performed using the Forest Tools package. This identified all the trees that were greater than 5 meters in height. I then compared the tree counts pre- and post-harvest to determine if they aligned with the retention guidelines. The results of the spatial analysis indicated that all retention guidelines were surpassed in harvesting. The canopy height models pre- and post-harvest that are here on the right display that significant harvesting was done, but we can see a higher retention level in the south where we had more of those BMP areas. In these maps, the lighter green represents vegetation between 0 and 5 meters in height, whereas the dark green represents vegetation greater than 5 meters in height. The BMP guidelines not related to retention were more difficult to evaluate and measure, unfortunately. Harvesters were informed of these guidelines in advance, and we assumed that they followed them to the best of their ability when it was safe to do so. The acoustic methods were more complex and infinitely more time-consuming than the spatial methods. As I noted earlier, the air used were deployed in the site prior to the OSFL arrival in spring 2022 and collected following departure. As you can imagine, the ARUs collected a large quantity of data, so the first thing we did was run all of the recordings through BirdNet Analyzer to get a general idea of when vocalizations were occurring and about how many were observed. From here, it would have been excellent to have BirdNet total all songs for each recording, but we quickly found that we could not get the program to identify only songs and that it would only identify songs and calls. As a result, we selected 4 recordings per day around sunrise to manually analyze in Raven for both River Tillard and the NHB13 control site. For each of the 10-minute recordings, we counted the number of songs and individual pips observed. We also noted instances where vocalizations may have indicated the presence of a male and a female. Once we had totaled the songs found in each recording, we visualized these rates across time and compared those to the results from right. Before I get into the results, I just want to explain more about what I mean by noting instances where vocalizations indicated the presence of a male and female. Firstly, we predicted that during times when pips of varied volumes were heard, like shown above, that was when a male and female were both calling at the same time. On the bottom, we have an example of pips clearly overlapping with songs, which we also assumed was a male and a female interacting. Okay, now moving on to the results. Interestingly enough, we found very different diurnal and seasonal variation in song rate between the harvested and the unharvested site. For River Tillard, the seasonal variation represented by mean song rate averaged across weeks is shown here in the black on the top. While it does not look exactly like any of the lines in the plot below from rights data, we can still draw some predictions from it. I also just want to make a note that the data collected for our project at this site spanned 12 weeks and began before arrival and ended after departure. Rights data is from only 8 weeks and seemingly begins at the time of female arrival. For the River Tiller data, we can see that there is not a consistent high singing rate through the whole season, indicating that this individual was not unpaired. Additionally, at no point do we observe a sudden increase in singing following a period of relatively low levels, which might indicate that it was not a failed nest. Thus, we can conclude that the seasonal song variation for River Tillard is consistent with the data that would be expected of a male OSFL that paired and nested successfully. This conclusion is further supported by the lack of observed diurnal variation. As you can see, the majority of the singing through the whole season occurred in the first 2 earlier recordings out of the 4. This also aligns with the data expected of a male that nested successfully. Additionally, at the River Tillard site, there were several instances where we had the occurrence where males and females may have been communicating with each other, so we had lots of pips of different volumes occurring. Right away, looking at the results from NHB13, we can see that they look very different from that of River Tillard. Once again, it doesn't look like any of the data from Wright, but similarly, ours was collected over a 16-week time span, starting before arrival and ending after, whereas his was collected only over 8 weeks. For the NHB13 data, we can see that there is not a consistent high singing rate throughout the whole season, like with River Tillard, indicating that this individual was not unpaired. Additionally, we do observe an instance at around week 9 where the singing rate suddenly increases following a period of low levels, which might indicate that it was not a successful nest. Thus, we conclude that the seasonal song variation for NHB13 is consistent with the data expected of a male OSFL that paired but had a failed nest. Once again, this conclusion is further supported by the observed diurnal variation. As we can see, in addition to the early singing near the start of the season, there's also a notable amount of singing later in the morning, beginning around mid-July, which also aligns with the data expected of a male with a failed nest. Similar to River Tillard, We also had instances in NHB 1.3 where there were pips of varied volumes adjacent to each other, as well as occurrences where there were songs overlapped with pips. In addition to song rate, we also totaled pips found in the recordings for the two sites. While there's no observed direct, to my knowledge, connection between pip rate and breeding status, it was interesting to note that for both sites, the pip rate was highest later in the season. For River Tillard, we also see a large period of time kind of in the middle of the plot there where no pipping was seen. And we don't have this gap in NHB 1.3. So just something interesting to note. So with those results in mind, let's return to the main acoustic question. Did vocalizations indicate successful pairing and nesting? The answer is yes and no. Oh, sorry. Had a little oopsie there. Okay, yes and no. For River Tillard, our song rate data was consistent with that expected of a male that had paired and successfully nested. Whereas for NHB 1.3, our song rate aligned with what was expected of a male that was paired and had a failed nest. At this point, you're probably realizing that the site harvested with BNPs turned out to be better for the reproduction of the flycatchers as opposed to the control site. Which brings us to the general question of, so what does this mean in terms of the effectiveness of the BNPs? In conclusion, it means that when using reproductive success as a measure of the effectiveness of conservation efforts, it's evident that harvesting completed in accordance with the BNP guidelines did not negatively impact the species. The male olive-sided flycatcher in River Tillard exhibited song rate activity patterns expected of pairing and successful nesting, which tells us that the harvesting was successful in preserving habitat characteristics that supported the occupation of the olive-sided flycatchers and their successful apparent breeding. On the other hand, the birds occupying the non-BNP site, NHB 1.3, were found to be paired but likely experience a failed nest. This contrasts pretty heavily with findings of other research relating to the effects of forest harvesting on OSFL nest success, which all found decreased success in harvested stands. However, you have to keep in mind that this was a very small sample size, so in addition to the other limitations present with the study, we have to consider these when we're interpreting the results. So, like with many other research projects, I believe that sample size was the most significant limitation here. Firstly, the BNPs had only been applied to one site in the province, the place in Cape Breton, and we only had one breeding season worth of acoustic data to explore. Secondly, as we were not able to find a program that would automatically identify songs and songs alone, we were forced to do this manually. This obviously took a lot of time and maybe made me a bit stir crazy. Since this step was not automated, we also only had the time to look at 4 10-minute recordings for each site and could only look at one control site. I've also included some pictures here from me throughout the year staring endlessly at spectrograms going crazy. Right, another limitation had to do with location. The experimental site and the control site were in very different areas of the province. While they were both in forested wetland habitats, the difference in location may have resulted in them being impacted differently by various weather events. One thing that comes to my mind specifically when I think of spring/summer 2023 was the incredible wildfires we had in the province. And I am curious as to whether this would have impacted the olive-sided flycatchers in one or more of these sites. Another main limitation was related to how much research has already been done on this topic, which is not very much, unfortunately. The majority of my methods were developed based on findings from Wright's foundational study. Apart from this project, there is a severe lack of research comparing song rates and breeding status that is supported by in-person behavioral evidence. Weather was also a big limitation here. When we were analyzing the data in Raven, we relied mostly on the visual presence of songs and pips in the form of like spectrograms, often only listening to the recordings if we were uncertain on what it would be. During periods of intense wind or rain, as shown here, it became more challenging to identify the vocalizations, especially if they were extremely faint. In addition to this, strong weather conditions have shown in the past to impact bird vocalization frequently in general, so this was a factor that was out of our control as well. Now that we've gone over the results, conclusions, and limitations, I want to touch on potential future works related to this project. Firstly, with existing tools like BirdNet Analyzer, it should not be overly complicated to create a system to automatically identify vocalizations, but be capable of differentiating them based on songs and calls. The manual analysis in this project was extremely time-consuming and should be avoided in the future if possible. Secondly, based on our results, BMPs should be implemented in other harvesting done in the province. Once this is done, data could be collected, analyzed, ideally automatically, and we could have a greater understanding of how the BMPs support conservation of olive-sided flycatchers. All right, so that pretty much wraps up my research on exploring the effectiveness of BMPs. But since I think I have more time here, I want to touch briefly on one of the other findings, not really directly related to my research question, but one that I find interesting, which is the shortcomings of BirdNet Analyzer in identifying the olive-sided flycatcher. So obviously there's no denying that the BirdNet program is incredibly useful in analyzing acoustic data, but like all things, it does have its shortcomings. Firstly, and of course most relevant to this project, its inability to automatically differentiate songs and calls. Given that many bird species have song rates that relate at least somewhat to breeding status, having this capability could be a really efficient way to quickly assess reproductive status of individuals based on remotely collected acoustic data. Secondly, depending on the settings specified by the user in BirdNet, it will output either an overprediction or an underprediction of the amount of vocalizations, which is obviously not a problem if you're doing presence-absence research, but for my case, where we did care about quantity, it was challenging. For our study, we prioritized identifying all possible vocalizations present, so we scheduled a shorter overlay time, which resulted in many vocalizations being overcounted. So in this spectrogram here, we had two obvious olive-sided flycatcher songs, but BirdNet counted it as 4. Another shortcoming that was that it would sometimes miss vocalizations, often as a result of like weather or other overlapping singing of various other bird species. However, there was some instances, like the one in the bottom right here, where it was a perfectly crystal clear spectrogram, there was no weather in the back, but BirdNet just missed it. Lastly, we observed one instance when BirdNet misidentified another species as being an olive-sided flycatcher. Here we can see a clear hermit thrush song in the spectrogram, yet BirdNet marked it as an OSFL. Now, this could be considered a shortcoming as it did happen, but also as a success as it only happened once. Regardless of these shortcomings, BirdNet is still beneficial to this project, as it helped to provide us with a preliminary understanding of the distribution of the vocalizations across time. All right, so that's all I have to share about my project, but before I move on to acknowledgements and questions, I just want to briefly summarize what I learned and kind of my overall research experience. So first, I learned that I love doing research. It was really interesting to see the project change and develop through the year. Fun fact, this project originally was supposed to be on Canada warblers, but I eventually switched to olive-sided flycatchers because I was more interested in their songs. With this, I also found that nothing ever goes to plan, obviously, and that you always need to be ready to be able to adapt and make changes. I also learned the importance of being an effective science communicator. I used to be a very anxious public speaker, but I found that I really enjoyed talking to others about my work at conferences and such, and it was really great to see when people were genuinely interested in what I was doing. Finally, I learned that I love birds, which I guess I knew before, but I hope that for the rest of my life, I can continue to contribute to conservation related to birds. All right, so this project would not have been possible without the help of many people. I especially just wanted to highlight the support I received from Dr. Stasier and her team, as well as professors at Dalhousie, Dr. Tara Wright, and Dr. Chris Green. I also want to thank Maya Baxter and Bridget McPhail, who were incredible students from the Dalhousie Integrated Science program that helped me look at hours and hours of recordings. I also want to thank the Nova Scotia Bird Society for supporting me through the E&A McLaren Memorial Scholarship and giving me the opportunity to present to you guys today. Finally, I want to thank, of course, the Olive-sided Flycatchers for their performance. Okay, all right, that's all I have. Hopefully that was good. Okay, thank you everyone for listening.
I got a question. Of course, I've got a question. I always talk too much.
Okay, I would love to hear your question.
How do you see the ARUs, the, I don't know, bird nets, the audio moss that we've got here, the usage changing in the future with these automated systems?
Yeah, so I was really taken aback because I thought that we would be able to, I thought that there would already be an automated process that we could use to identify like songs and pips individually. And when Cindy was like, "Oh no, you'll have to do it manually," my heart did break a little bit for like all the time I would spend. But I definitely foresee that being a thing in the future. I think especially with the budget, like audio moss, they're quite cheaper than the like wildlife acoustic brands, if I'm correct. I think as soon as like we learn how to make those at a more efficient cost, then it becomes more accessible to research. People can deploy them in remote areas, and we can learn more about birds that are inhabiting spaces that are more inaccessible to us. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are using Merlin Sound ID. We get bombarded, I can't
Yes.
put it any other way, with some very interesting identifications. And I always reply to these people, take it in context. If
Yeah.
your Merlin Sound ID is picking up a, I don't know, a bird from the Indian subcontinent, it's highly unlikely it happens. It's highly unlikely it's in downtown Dartmouth. Not impossible. I mean, heck, we got a Steller's seagull that visited us twice and is now living in Newfie. Anything can happen. But I've got a fantasy Merlin bird ID list from Sound of about 50 species, all of which may be in our yard here on Cape Forshoe, but they're probably not. I mean, it's an unbelievable species from stuff around the world. And yes, I've got the right packs in there, etc., etc. But it really does have a few
Sure.
interesting brain farts when it comes
Yeah.
up with stuff.
It's funny you should mention that. I'm the teaching assistant for the like environmental field methods course, and we did like a introduction birding at Point Pleasant. And when we were finished, one of the students comes up to me and they're like, I don't remember what species it was, but they were like, "Look at what we got like on Merlin." And I was like, "Okay, like sure, it's not something I'm familiar with." So we pulled up like the Audubon app to look at its distribution, and I was like, "See how it's only found in Central America? Maybe let's evaluate the fact that this app could be wrong." So it was a good learning experience because it taught them to not just rely on it for 100% certain identifications.
Yeah, and people are using it as part of their eBird reports, and it certainly is. It's corrupting some data that's out there now. That's for sure. I mean, the biggest, commonest one we see is the tufted titmouse.
Yes.
It gets reported across Nova Scotia. It's not impossible. There are some here now. There's a few in New Brunswick, but it's unlikely as yet. Are they coming? Yeah, probably. But it's going to take many years. But we get so many reports of tufted titmice, it's not even funny.
Yeah.
You have to gently let the people down. I mean, until I see a photograph of one sitting at somebody's feeder in Stewiacke, I'm not going to believe that Merlin's got it right. I'm sorry, I'm not.
Yeah. I'm with the agreement that it's a good tool to use to help yourself like confirm what you believe to be true. Like if I'm hearing like a warbler that I'm not as familiar with and like I can pull out Merlin and I'm like, "Oh, it agrees that it's, like a chestnut-sided warbler." Like good for me, but like it should be kind of a secondary source in addition to just your own ear identification.
I find it useful now I'm getting older and the very high frequencies. I can't hear golden crown kinglets anymore. I love them, I can't hear them. But if Merlin's pinging off telling me there's one in the area, I spend more time searching into the areas where I expect them to be.
Yeah.
So it is useful, but it's got to be taken in context, please.
Yeah. I would love to see some just like research on like people's perspectives and opinions of the Merlin app. Just like among birders, I think it'd be really interesting to see.
It's on my phone. I believe it. It's true. That's what we hear.
The Facebook page always gets me too.
It is interesting to say the least. What sort of area was that control location in Southwest Nova?
So it was in one of the spaces controlled by the Medway Community Forest Co-op.
Okay.
So they worked with Dr. Stasier and agreed to have like ARUs deployed so we could just gather some baseline information on the vocalizations.
I'll shut up for a minute. What questions have other people got? Because I'll just keep talking all night.
I was wondering if you had multiple audio recorders per location or if it was just
Yeah,
one.
let me pull up, let me go to one of the maps. So we were really ambitious when we started this project and we were like, oh, we can get so much done. And then we found out that we have to do it manually. So on the map of the BNPs, the ARU that we used to collect the data for this was placed in the kind of bottom right area where you see that big, not the bottom right, the bottom center where you see that big cluster of dark green. The ARU that we looked at the data for this one was like right kind of smack dab in that area, but there was two other ARUs deployed at this site specifically. So one was at that top section where there's that little chunk of green, and then there was another one kind of on the far right, kind of placed off of the stand actually. But yeah, we did run into some, it was tricky because we would be like listening to them and sometimes we'd hear like background pips as well. And we were like, oh, is that maybe one of the other individuals? Because the field surveys showed there was 3 pairs there. So there was the one pair kind of on the north side, another pair kind of in the like center lower area, and then one pair to the far right. There's not a lot of really like set in stone information on the size of their territories, but there were some periods where I heard 2 songs like overlapping in the recording. So when that happened, I had to pull up Raven on my 2 screens, and then for the same time on the same day, I had to pull up the recording for the right ARU and my ARU and see that it was like, oh, it's the male from like the other pair. So, but it was really tricky. I had, because like most of the time the songs, like the spectrogram for the songs looked like very similar, right? But sometimes they looked a bit different, and there wasn't any clear research that I found that showed that there was variation in spectrograms between males. I would like to see if that would be the case, maybe if someone did work on that, but I did wonder sometimes if like the more curvy one was like the one not at my ARU, and then the more like flat one was the one at my ARU. So it's a little bit interesting. Okay, I see a message in the chat. Yeah, so the ARUs were deployed based on the sightings in the previous year. So the green markings on the map right now, those were where the birds were observed before the ARUs were placed. So this was from the 2022 field surveys that were done, and that's when the ARUs were deployed. And then in 2023, post-harvest was the summer that the data was collected from. Does that make sense? Did I explain that right? Maybe? Okay.
Are you finding the recommendations from the Leahy report are being used in the province, or
That's a
a
really,
little controversial?
I'm really interested in ecological forestry, so I did some like additional digging outside of the project, but it's tricky because the ecological forestry implementations in the province only apply to crown land, which is only 30% of forests in the province, whereas 70% belongs to private landowners, primarily like small woodlot owners. And obviously you can't force private property owners to implement specific like harvesting practices that don't primarily have financial gain in mind. So that's really tricky, but I did see that notes related to ecological forestry were added, I believe in 2023 to the Environmental Goals and Climate Change Act in the province. So there is mention of ecological forestry in legislation now, which is great. But I mean, I personally haven't heard much in the news about its implementation. I know that the Ecological Forestry Research Initiative, which is based out of a lab at Dalhousie, got multi-millions of dollars last year to do more research on kind of its implementation. But I think in the coming years we'll see more about it. But as of right now, I don't know too much.
Yeah, I think the small woodlot owners are I don't want to be controversial, but probably more receptive than the big multinationals. But
Yeah,
that's my
I would kind of
personal
agree.
thoughts.
Yeah. I know that there is a like a group of like, isn't there like a Woodlot Owner of the Year award that Nova Scotia gives out to like the ones that keep conservation in mind the most or something? Sustainable harvesting. I believe that's a thing. Yeah,
It could be. Have you interacted with John Kearney Associates on the audio identification stuff?
John Kearney, I have
Kearney.
not. Who is that?
He is based near here, friend of ours, and he is very, very, very switched on for audio monitoring. He's been doing it for 20 years.
Mhm.
And he really knows his stuff. John Kearney Associates. Just Google it, you'll find it. Really
Right.
nice guy. Very, very enthusiastic for the system and the project, the actual product, and well worth talking to about any automated ID, etc., etc. I think for the future.
It is unfortunate, because this was like my honors project. I finished in April, and honestly, I hadn't really looked at it until like this last week when I was putting the presentation together. So I had to reread my whole thesis and everything. So I'm not as up to date with the project as I would hope to be. But yeah, I definitely, the last I spoke with Cindy, I was under the impression that the next steps would be figuring out either how to build a machine learning model to do the identification itself, but like obviously that requires a very significant familiarity with computer science systems, which I don't have. I don't I don't know anyone in environmental sciences and undergrad that has that, but I think that would be the best next steps for the project.
Yeah, it's really is well worth talking to John about that sort of thing. That's his
Okay.
world.
Thank you, Sarah, for sending that in the chat. I will forward it over to Dr. Stacer at least for sure.
That's good. Must be some more questions out there. Come on, folks. Wow, it's gone very quiet.
The lively group.
Well, me talking all the time, of course. But, yeah, it's a very controversial at times subject with the forestry in Nova Scotia, with the big companies out there, etc., etc. They're trying to, I don't know, they're trying to make money at the end of the day as from a resource, and we're trying to conserve our birds. It's a difficult area to say the least.
Yeah. It also is, like I mentioned in my presentation, there were like several other guidelines included in the BMPs for the OSFL, but the only one that we could really quantify like easily was the retention levels. So they had to maintain snags when it was like safe to do so, and they were supposed to leave woody debris, which we did observe. Like I got the chance to go to the site in the summer of 2023 just to do some like field surveys, and there was definitely lots of woody debris on the ground following harvesting, and we did see some snags, which was great. But in regards to the other things, like it's we told the harvesters what to do, and we can only just like hope that they did it to the best of their abilities, right? So
yeah, sometimes, I mean, some species certainly we'll say flourish after
yeah,
it does happen, and then hopefully as things grow up, the other species displaced do come back.
I had read in it's been a couple months, so I'm not as familiar with it as it was, but I had read in some of the literature the terminology of like an ecological trap, where they would do, Sarah's nodding, okay, so you've heard this term before. To my understanding, it's when they harvest in a way that is supposed to like mimic natural disturbances, but it ends up being like decreasing the nest success rate as opposed to if it was a natural disturbance. Sarah, am I correct on that? Do you know?
Yeah, the ecological trap, I think, can be applied to a lot of things. And I think for harvested areas, I'm not sure it's really well understood, but I would, a good way to describe it is say you've got an urban place and a song sparrow finds a place that in nature would be a really good place to nest. But in an urban environment, maybe there's cats that are predators. So the bird is attracted to this spot that looks like really good habitat, but there's other factors
Yeah.
we've introduced that make it not as good a place to nest.
Yes.
Sort of that ecological trap where it looks like a good place, but there's things that the birds aren't picking up on that have created this trap for them.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I think I probably just read about it in the context of forestry, so I was like, this must be what it is. But no, that's a really good explanation.
Yeah. And I feel like I've heard about it in the context of forestry, but I haven't heard it explained like,
Mm.
yes, for sure, we know that clear cutting creates an ecological trap for these species because
Yeah.
of this. I haven't read enough to.
Yeah. I only came across the term I think once. So, but yeah. Okay, so there's a question in the chat. What is the possibility to combine these methods with on-the-ground work on breeding territory size and other feeding ecology observation? Wow, good question. I know that it's I would have known the number off the top of my head if it was last year, but there was a certain distance that like under ideal weather conditions, like the song meter minis can hear from, like a certain meter distance based on like average volume or such. I'm actually not sure how that would work. I guess you could deploy ARUs in addition to doing in-person surveys to observe any like behavioral indications of breeding status and then kind of compare those to the song rates, which is what Wright did. But I'm not sure how that would really tie into territory size. But yeah, that's a good point. Interested to see.
Multiple ARUs, you could be getting the same bird being picked up on several receivers as well.
Yeah. I think one of the things I definitely want to learn, and I think it would definitely be possible to do with the amount of like just audio recordings that are available at the Cornell library, you should be able to do a study that identifies whether there is notable between individual variation in like the spectrograms of the songs for the birds. The project I did in the ornithology class was on that for eastern wood pewees, and we did find that you could differentiate the individuals to a point based on like how different like the volumes and the times were between the different aspects of their song. But it should be doable for the olive-sideds as well.
Yeah, I seem to remember going to a presentation on these birds at risk, and they talked about the different species, like the olive-sided, since it's a flycatcher. They're, I don't know if born with a song is quite the term that they use.
There's a fancy term for it.
Yeah.
But so essentially flycatchers fall under a category of birds that they don't learn their songs, like they just know it, whereas like opposed to a Canada warbler, it has to learn its song, right? When I was working in Alberta at the banding station, so many Canada warblers there. First of all, you wouldn't think they were at risk based on just that one location, but I got the chance to hear like the juvenile Canada warblers like trying to get it going, and I was like, wow, you sound awful. But yeah, so it's the two groups of, I don't know the fancy word for that. Tony, do you know?
No.
Nope. Yeah, I don't know, but there is a fancy word for it, and flycatchers fall under the category of the people that just know their song, which is great.
Which I think allows you to pick out individuals because their song stays the same.
Yeah, I think,
like your peewees, but
yeah,
it'd be interesting.
I think flycatchers was one of my favorite groups of birds for sure. Also, easier to identify, which is nice when you're a new birder.
Auditory, easier to identify
Auditory,
by
yes, I
audio.
will admit. The rest of them are just gray, just gray. But yeah,
Flycatchers are always an interesting one in the field. I mean, it makes life so much easier if you can hear them.
yeah,
Not so much with the olive-sided, but other stuff. You can take into account the context of where it is, etc., etc., and sometimes its behavior, but there's always that nagging doubt. Is it
yeah,
a least? Is it an older, etc., etc., etc.?
yeah. I remember even at the banding station when they were like actually handling the birds, I was asking them like how you tell the difference between like a least and an alder, and they're like the ones in like the Impidinax genus or however you say that are just very, very hard to identify. Like hard to differentiate. Like even if they're just like looking at the tiny like feather patterns or all of this, they're like sometimes we put like a slash, it could be either or. And I'm
Yeah.
like, wow, yeah. Yeah.
Do you think the future is bright for the olive-sided? Or
I like to think it is, especially because they're a species that does so well with edge habitat and like they don't hate forest harvesting, right? Because it does create habitat that they prefer. But especially if we're moving forward with like the ecological forestry with more selective harvesting done, I think it just creates habitat that is very suitable for them. But that is, of course, that only depends on what we can do for them in the breeding range. I know that they face a lot of habitat loss down south as well through mostly conversion to like agricultural lands, which we can't control from here. But on a Canada and North America specific, I think hopefully positive, but I guess we'll just have to see, right?
we can help, but the wintering grounds play a very big part in their survival.
Yeah, they do.
Plus pesticide use, climate change affecting when the bugs hatch and don't hatch, and etc., etc.
On the note of bugs, I was actually talking to my friend about I hadn't heard of it before, but like the windshield effect. Have you heard of that? So when I was a kid and we would go on camping trips, I remember coming back and the front of the van and the windshield just being like coated in bugs, right? But when I go on a camping trip now, I don't need to scrape the bugs off when I'm done. Like there's just not nearly as many as there was even like 15 years ago. So
It is very, very noticeable. I did a presentation for the museum down here a couple of months ago about climate change affecting birds. And when you did start drilling down to the data, you know, the fact that bugs are in some species coming out 2 or 3 weeks earlier than they used to, hatching.
yeah.
The birds are still halfway down south. Other birds on the way back up here are getting back up here 40% faster than they were 10, 15 years ago. Which is great, but it's tiring them out on the way up here, so it isn't improving the breeding situation. It's a real interesting but slightly scary subject.
Yeah, I think for like future research I want to do, I'm currently like looking into potentially a master's in the future. And I think I do want to do more work with like tracking migration patterns and like locations and such. I think that would be really interesting. I did really enjoy the acoustic part and like it holds a special place in my heart, but I do want to do more of like a spatial aspect. I'm currently doing like a GIS program at NSCC, so I'm kind of hoping to use those skills more in exploring bird conservation in the future. But yeah,
I think the American redstart was the one that's getting back 40% faster, if I remember right. It's unbelievable.
yeah.
Plus, I say they're turning up. There's the food's either here or gone here, etc., etc. Oh, you got another question up in the chat box.
I believe it's just a comment. Non-native plants
Okay.
are also contributing to insect decline. Yes, of course. Many of these non-natives feed very few insects. Yes, also true.
You've only got to look out there at certainly in our yard where the majority of it is completely natural, shall we say.
Yeah.
The way the sparrows have been in the goldenrod in the last week or so, my goodness me, it's been amazing.
Oh, and then another comment. Aerial insectivores have declined 43% since 1970. Yep.
Yeah.
Lots of positive news out there when it comes to the status of bird populations.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm looking outside at where the goldenrod is. It's pitch black out there.
Sometimes you have to seek out the positive news, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
it's important to make sure we're all doing that just so we can keep an optimistic outlook on things.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Cool. We have no more questions from anybody at all?
I will stop.
Good in the chat, Hannah?
Not that I see, no.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you for your talk this evening and insight into the subject. All the best for the future, and once you start delving into migration, oh, it's a wormhole you won't come out of. It's the most amazing subject there is.
Okay,
It really
well,
is.
I'm very excited to hopefully get into that. And thank you
Great.
so much for having me. It was awesome.
Cool. Thank you very much indeed again.
Thanks.
And we'll leave things, and I hope to see lots of people at the AGM in November.
I will try to be there. I hadn't heard of it until now, so
Yeah.
that sounds great.
On the Facebook, Nova Scotia Bird Society Facebook, and then just go up to events and it's there.
All right, perfect. I will do that. Thank you
You
very
get a
much.
chance to hear me talking as well.
Awesome.
Even more. But no, it's going to be great. So thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Have a great evening. And in the next few days, the YouTube of this will be up and running. So thanks again. Have a great evening, everybody. Get out this weekend and do some birding.
Yes, for sure. Okay. All right. Bye, everyone.
Check out all those funky sparrows because the flycatchers aren't really around now. Take care.